Thank you very much for hearing us today. And sorry if there's a bit of noise in the background. I'm at a conference at the minute. But obviously, my name is James Ross. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Taxpayers Union. We represent 200,000 members and supporters who lend us their voice to push for efficient and effective policy from government at all levels. And as you may have picked up from our written submission, in this particular instance, we feel that this bill falls well short of that threshold. Now, the first point I'd make is that just in terms of themes, our reading of this is that this bill is trying to address almost a moral issue that doesn't exist in reality. It's arguing, as we've just heard, and a lot of these large media firms are arguing that these digital platforms are they're controlling the landscape and they're controlling access to who can access what and when. But the facts of the matter are that these media platforms, if they so choose, can opt out. They can stop their websites being scrubbed for headlines. They can choose not to have their content posted on these platforms. But rather than doing that, more often than not, they're posting them on social media themselves. Now it's clear as day as a reading that they see that the arrangement as it stands is mutually beneficial. What a lot of these big companies are trying to do, to our eyes, is screw the scrum. So, from Google's submission, they estimate that 44 million in revenue was generated for New Zealand news firms just from their Google searches alone. Obviously, there's other platforms there. But what these companies are trying to do is extract more revenue from them. Now, that's almost a sort of bizarre Muldoonist style protectionist policy. And I shouldn't need to remind the people in this room how well that worked the first time. Aside from that, of course, digging into the actual policy, there's the issue that, in our view, it just doesn't work. Now, if we look at international examples, I think there's fairly clear international evidence that policies such as this lead to reduced access to news. If we take, say, a Canadian example with Bill C-18, the Online News Act, which, by making it commercially unviable for companies like Meta and Google to continue hosting this content, by potentially exposing them to unlimited liabilities, news was pulled from Facebook. And without being too extreme, over the summer of 2023, the lack of easy access to ready and responsive news led to the loss of lives and livelihoods in the wildfires. Now, the simple facts of the matter are people need easy access to the news. These platforms provide that access to the news. This bill would reduce access to that news. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say in a country such as New Zealand, which is no stranger to acts of God, with the floods and the earthquakes that we've seen over the last few years, that this bill could quite seriously put lives at risk. That's, of course, as well as that, of course, reduced access to this trusted, verifiable news leaves a void. That void is going to be filled, and it tends to be filled by lower quality, poorly sourced news, leading inevitably to an increase in the flow of misinformation and an increase in political polarization, which, of course, I shouldn't need to stress that at a moment like this in New Zealand's constitutional history is clearly problematic. It's not the only example, of course, of an international example of a bill such as this that hasn't worked. Now, the purpose of this bill is to tip the scales a bit in favor of news media, to increase their profitability. But if we take the example of Spain, now there, like here, their bill was aimed at protecting local media, and particularly small local media. But the evidence shows that their equivalent to this bill saw not only a 6% fall in traffic to news sites, but what we find particularly damning is it saw a 14% drop in traffic to small local news sites. It's these local media organizations that are they're most at risk financially. They're in the most precarious position. And I think the evidence is fairly clear internationally that a bill such as this does advantage these large firms like Stuff and NZME to the disadvantage of smaller local news. Now, an increased reliance on just a few media sources inevitably will undermine trust in the media. It dissuades new upstart firms, and buttressed by the fact that, just as a simple fact of commercial reality, these huge firms are going to have more bargaining power than the smaller firms. This is going to shut out the small local media organizations that this bill is aiming to protect. In terms of, now our reading as a more pertinent point to us specifically is that the wording around the sort of framing of this bill and who it's aimed at is clearly designed to target Google and Meta, but the sort of open-ended wording, and a few other civil society organizations have had the same reading, is that who gets defined as a media organization could potentially be a particular, a very subjective definition. Now, with our 200,000 members and supporters, we provide them with ready access to news through newsletters and blogs, as do scores and scores of other civil society organizations. The simple fact of the matter is that if we fell victim to the provisions of this bill, we would have to stop doing that. And hundreds of thousands of people from our organization alone would suddenly lose access to ready and available news in this regard. And the same is true across the board with other organizations. Now, that's not only damaging to civil society, clearly that's damaging to democracy. Now, just to bring this to a close slightly, if I can quote some wise words from one Melissa Lee, this bill is literally a shakedown, were her words a few months ago. And on this particular instance, we happen to agree with her. For the sake of our vibrant and free media culture in this country, I would implore those on the committee to listen to her advice on this and to seriously reevaluate what this bill is aiming to do. There's been a number of U-turns from this government already over say, the app tax and the trust tax that, although inexcusable, there's a monetary gain for the government in doing so. But in this particular instance, there's no monetary advantage to the government from this bill. International examples show that the media landscape and society as a whole will be worse off from this bill. And given that everybody in New Zealand, bar a few large vested interests in the media industry, will be left worse off by the bill, we really struggle to see how it's got this far. The bill, as it stands, is simply unworkable, and we fail to see how it can progress. Thank you.
Thank you.